Welcome to A Well Cared For Human, the podcast that tries to convince you that you are 100% normal and an even better than okay example of the human species, despite the fact that sometimes we feel like the craziest, most incapable, or worthless creatures on the face of this planet. I'm Corey, an author, a creative, and the host of the show. Whatever you're bringing to the table today, I hope this episode proves to be a dose of inspiration for you on your quest to become a well-cared-for human. You can find the episode show notes, your free wellness blueprint, and more at awellcaredforhuman.com. And as always, thank you for listening. Hello, humans. It's your host, Corey, and today we're going to talk about guilt. And it's something I know quite a bit about, as I lived a very large chunk of my early years racked with guilt. Particularly one example of guilt that really stands out for me, a very impactful moment of guilt in my life. And then also talk a little bit about why we feel guilty and what we can do to heal that sense of guilt, whether it's merited, is it a bad thing to feel guilty, so on and so forth. And so that will be the focus of today's episode. Now, in my own personal story of guilt, there is an instant in my life that comes to mind whenever I'm like, when did I feel my most guilty, or when was I carrying around a lot of guilt? And that was 14 years before my mother died. And so I'm going to take you through what happened and why it was filling me full of guilt. And so I got a phone call in July of 2006. So this was exactly 14 years before I got another phone call in July, the one telling me that my mother had been murdered, that my uncle was being arrested because they thought that he was responsible for her death. Before all of that happened, I had a different terrible phone call that came in July. And in that phone call, July 2006, it was from Vanderbilt Hospital. There was a doctor that was calling me, telling me that my mother was in critical condition, that she had been assaulted by my uncle, that something had actually struck her so hard on the head that it had caved in part of that side. And so she needed emergency brain surgery, and they were going to do their best to stitch her up, to save her life, and how soon could I get to the hospital? And of course, immediately I'm like, I will be there now, even though I lived about an hour away at the time. So I'm driving to the hospital, I'm wondering what's happening. I found out later that what he struck her with was a glass ashtray, but I didn't know that at the time. And I go into this hospital room, and there she is, and she's all bandaged up. She looks awful. She looks like she's on death's door. And they're asking her the normal questions that they ask a person who has a brain injury, like, do you know what day it is? Do you know what your name is? Do you know who the president is? And the doctor that was in there at the time pointed at me and was like, do you know who this is? And she couldn't even answer any of these questions. She had temporarily lost her ability to speak. And after this, they send her to a rehabilitation facility so she can learn how to speak and walk again. But in this moment, fresh from surgery, she did not know how to walk or talk or any of that. And so things were pretty bad. I thought that she was definitely going to die, or she had come very close to it, but somehow she had pulled through. And I tried to do everything I could to make sure she did not have to go back to my grandmother's house after this incident. I started completely rearranging my life. I was trying to get a space set up for her inside my duplex that I was living in at the time where she could sleep. I didn't know how I was going to support us both financially. I wasn't making a lot of money. I was a student, and I was still going to try to figure out how to make this work. And then I get a phone call about 2 weeks into her stay at the rehabilitation center saying that she's gone, that she left. Someone came and signed her out, and they were notifying me because I was supposed to be the point of contact. And I was like, what do you mean she's gone? Who signed her out? And they couldn't tell me anything. And so, of course, I'm in a panic. I try calling everyone we've ever met, everyone that I think she would have talked to or she would have gone home with or whatever. No one's seen her. No one knows where she is. And I finally find her, of all places, back at my grandmother's house. And you would have thought maybe I should have checked there first, but it just did not occur to me that after what happened to her, she would go back to that house where she had almost died, because of course my uncle was living there as well. So it was her, my uncle, and my grandmother. And so they were all living there in that house together. And yeah, it just blew my mind. I just did not think she would go back to that situation after what had just happened to her. And so I go to my grandmother's. I call her from the end of the driveway because I will not go into the house where my uncle is. I ran into him. He tried to assault me once, and that was enough for me. I didn't need to have a repeat. So I wouldn't even go into the house with him there. And I called her from the driveway on my little flip phone, if you remember. You remember those? I called her on my flip phone and I was like, I'm down here at the end of the driveway. If you want to come out, you want to come home with me, you can stay with me. Just get whatever you want to bring with you and come meet me out here. You don't need to be here. It's not safe. And she was like, yes, of course. And so she comes out and she gets in the car and she's like, I just want to make one stop before we get on the highway and we go to your place because, again, I lived about an hour away. And I said that was fine because I figured she just wanted cigarettes. My mom has always been a smoker. She said she started at like 12 years old or something crazy when she told me many moons ago. And I thought that was fine, but the agreement was that she wasn't going to drink, not just because she was struggling with alcoholism and she shouldn't have been drinking, but also because she was on these medicines from her brain injury. Like, she wasn't supposed to be mixing alcohol with anything at the time, on top of the Hep C diagnosis that she already had, because my mother contracted hepatitis C from intravenous drug use many years ago in the 90s. And so she was like, of course, I promise I won't get any beer. But of course, what does she come out of the store with but a 6-pack of beer? Naturally, I am irate about this. I start yelling at her immediately. You should not be drinking. Why did you get that? What about your brain? If you start drinking that, you're going to die. You can't be drinking this alcohol. What about your hepatitis C? What about your brain meds? I forget what the brain meds are right now. I'm sure it had something to do with clotting or anything to keep stuff from happening in the brain post-brain surgery. Because, they had to open up her head and fix it. So I'm sure something serious happened in there. But I know she was on these medications for that. And her response to this was she opened the beer and started drinking it. And I was just so upset that she could do this to herself. Because all of my life, again, I'd had this instinct to protect my mother. Even when I was a little bitty kid and we were in these domestic violence situations, whether that domestic violence altercation was with my uncle or if it was with someone she was dating or whomever it was in the situation, my mother got into a lot of fights. I can't tell you how many fights she got into. Whenever I was present, I always tried to protect her, even as a little kid. But what can you do if the person that's hurting your mother is herself? Which is exactly what this situation was. And I kind of realized that in that moment. That was the light bulb moment for me, that the person that's hurting her the most is her, and I can't protect her from herself. And so I was just very upset. I was very mad. I drove her back to my grandmother's. I left her there at the end of the driveway, because again, I won't even go up to the house. And I drive away, and as I'm driving away, I'm filled with this crushing guilt that I'm making a mistake, that I'm letting her walk into a house with a guy, my uncle, who can almost certainly kill her, has almost killed her, and if I leave her there, she's gonna die. And I was really guilty about that for a long, long time. And then when she did die, in that house, killed by that man, all that guilt came back with a vengeance. I was just absolutely convinced that the reason why she was dead was my fault. It was my fault because I knew if I left her in that house, she would be killed by him. And look, 14 years later, lo and behold, it had happened. And so you couldn't have convinced me otherwise that it wasn't my fault that she was dead. And so I had a lot of guilt to work through when she died, and I had a lot to process. And there are just instances in our life, hopefully yours is not anywhere near as dramatic as mine, but if it is, there are just instances where we feel very guilty for something that happened, whether we did something wrong or we just blame ourselves for something. In both cases, the guilt can be absolutely debilitating. And this sense of guilt can come to us for a lot of different reasons. It could be, again, that we actually did something wrong and we feel bad about it. Or it could be that we hurt somebody and we feel bad about it. So for example, sometimes, especially when I was healing from all of my trauma, I was not always kind to people. I was not always patient. I was not my best self because I'm healing, I'm processing, and I had to forgive myself for those mistakes. So it could be for harming people, or it could also be because we feel like we're failing or we're not doing everything that we're supposed to do. There's usually a lot of expectations that are put upon us, either by people around us or by society as a whole. Expectations in our relationships, in our work, in all these different areas of our life that make us feel like we're letting people down or that we're just not good enough. So that can create guilt. That can be reinforced by social expectations. Again, people expecting certain things from you or expecting certain things from you because of a role that you hold. So if you are a certain person in the social standing, so I'm thinking doctors, teachers, lawyers, preachers, whomever you are. If we fall short in some way, we might feel guilty about it. Survivor's guilt. I definitely had a lot of survivor's guilt when I found out that my mother had been murdered because there was a lot of question around why me? Why was I here? Why was I okay when she wasn't okay? We're not so different. How is it that I made it out and she didn't make it out? So a lot of guilt around that. If you're a parent, you're probably struggling with guilt every day. Lots of expectation on parents to do everything and anything for their kids. So my point is that there's a lot of different sources and reasons why you could be feeling guilty. So chances are high, especially if you've chosen this episode and you're listening to it, chances are high that you have experienced guilt. And what do you do with that? If you have guilt, what are you supposed to do with all of that emotion? Because usually guilt is a very strong, very powerful, and again, can be very debilitating or crippling as an emotion. So what do we do with guilt? How do we process our guilt? The steps that I went through for me, or I guess how I was able to start to contextualize my guilt as I went along, a big component of that was first acknowledging that what I was feeling was guilt, which that in and of itself took a lot of untangling because I just had so many feelings. I had so many feelings early on that I didn't have names for, and I didn't understand what they were, and everything was just a jumbled mess, and I felt crazy, and it can be really hard to even label something for what it is. So that's why I'm always encouraging you to do the labeling meditation, where you can label something as thinking, or you label it as anger, or you label it as whatever the strong emotion is, just so that you can start to figure out what's going on with you. Because there's so much of our time that we just don't know what's going on. We don't understand what's happening. And we stay very confused by that. And it feels like we can't do anything. We can't get out from under all of these crushing feelings because we just don't know what they are. And we don't understand what's going on. So identifying my emotions for what they were, in this case, guilt. Realizing I feel guilty. That's what this is. I feel guilty. And then working to accept that. Working to accept a feeling, what that means is that you stop judging it. For a long time, I judged my guilt as bad. If I felt guilty, it's because I'm a bad person. I did something bad. I'm wrong. But that's a judgment I was placing on the emotion itself. Having guilt is a normal emotional response to something difficult, and it doesn't mean that you're not worthy as a person. It doesn't mean even necessarily that you did something wrong, because that decision to take care of myself rather than continuing to do the codependent spiral with my mother that was keeping us both stuck and unhealthy, that was not the right thing to do. And doing the right thing still left me with guilt. So feeling guilty doesn't always mean that you did something wrong. In fact, it can be misleading. It can tell you that you did something wrong, but actually you did the right thing. And so guilt and wrong or right, they're not directly connected. Guilt does not tell you if you did something right or wrong, so you can't go by that feeling. And it's a normal feeling to difficult situations that provoke guilt. And so the best thing to do is to try not to judge that you have guilt and try not to imbue it with meaning if you can help it. And then I had to work on building my awareness. Again, something I've done through meditation, in which I sit and I try to gradually strengthen my awareness of my environment. But in the case of guilt, how that applies is I used meditation and journaling to get clear on what was triggering my feelings of guilt. For example, I was able to uncover this particular memory of leaving her at the end of the driveway, and there was a lot of guilt attached to that. And so I began to unpack that, but I had to first identify what the memories were. I had to identify why I was feeling guilt in that moment. What other memories do I have that trigger guilt? And then start to unpack them and look at them rationally. So for example, it's been a long journey for me to recognize that the decision I made at the end of that driveway was still the right decision, even though I felt very guilty about it. For a long time, there was just the guilt. There was none of the awareness. There was no mental ability to say, hey, that was still the right decision. And that might be true for you as well, that you need to do enough reflection and analysis of these guilt-ridden memories that you have before you can even begin to see what really happened clearly. Because guarantee your memory of it is not clear. And so it's going to take some time and some conscious thought and contemplation to unpack that, to explore that. Also, maybe working with a therapist and have them challenge what you're thinking about at the end of the driveway moment. But I took that to therapy, and it was the therapist who was like, well, why do you feel guilty for keeping yourself alive? Like, if she was a healthy, happy mother, wouldn't she want you to protect yourself? If that was anyone else but her, wouldn't she want you to take care of yourself, to keep yourself safe, if she was in her right state of mind, if she was healthy and happy? And so what they do, a good therapist anyway, a good therapist is able to do is to challenge these negative beliefs that you have, these beliefs that might be, I guess we could call it warped by the emotion or the charge of a memory that you have. And so working with someone to unpack it and to see things differently helps if they're trained professionals working with particular emotions. Sometimes it's good to also just do it with your friends, but they can also be biased. Oh, of course it's not. They're very passionate on your side. They don't always necessarily take an objective point of view, so to speak. But reflect on what happened. Reflect on what your intentions were. Did you mean to do something bad? And even if you did, you need to unpack that. So, for example, going back to the parts of my life where I was not always loving and kind person, was I really wanting to hurt that person? If I dig deep and I look at that more closely, was I really trying to hurt them? And the answer is no. I was trying to escape my own pain. And this person was just the vehicle for me trying to do that. Now, in the event that you did do something that was, quote, bad, and I use that term very loosely. You can't see my air quotes that I'm making with my fingers right now, but bad, relatively. Let's say you did something that you regret. One of the ways to work with that in the context of guilt is, if you can, taking responsibility. So, for example, for a long time I had guilt over the way I treated one of my friends back in college. She didn't want to tell me something because she thought I would react badly. I found out from someone else. I reacted badly. Kind of proving her right that I would react badly about a decision she made. And I was really mean to her about it. And then I felt bad because it was like, oh, I guess she was right to hide it from me because I did react poorly. And later, many, many years later, goodness, 15 years later, 20 years later, I don't even know, I confessed to her that I had felt guilty about this all that time. And for her, it was nothing. She was like, oh my God, I haven't thought about that since then. But for me, it was such a big deal because I was carrying around this guilt. And so again, there's that notion that you might be making it into more of something than it really is. That because you feel guilty, you may not remember the events of the situation clearly. So all of that aside, if you can take responsibility for something, do it. Like, reach out and apologize to someone if you can, if you want to. That might help you alleviate your guilt. And expect to be really terrified to do it. So I was terrified to reach out to her and say this, even though it was a pretty minor confession, especially in her eyes. She didn't react at all. She was like, oh, I totally forgot about that. But for me, I was shaking. I felt so nervous to tell her. I was really tore up about it. It's really hard to tell somebody that you did something wrong, to admit to other people that you did something wrong, I guess I should say. But taking responsibility for something that happened, apologizing if you can apologize. Sometimes we can't, right? The person's dead. You can't do anything about it. Seeking forgiveness from them. Anything you can do to take responsibility, that is usually helpful. But something to say about asking for forgiveness is that they don't necessarily have to give it to you. The asking for forgiveness is two-layered. So if they accept it, good for them, good for you. If they don't accept it, it was still important that you asked for it if you felt like it was important to do so. So don't use that as another reason to beat yourself up, like they didn't accept my apology, so that just proves that I really am a terrible, awful person. Only thing that proves is that they are not in the place emotionally to do that right now. They're in a different place emotionally than you are. They're not ready to move past it. It does not mean that you're an awful, wretched person who deserves to have your apology rejected. Try not to imbue meaning into interactions that isn't necessarily there. You knew that you should apologize. You wanted to apologize. You did apologize. They didn't accept your apology. Fine. But you knew what you needed to do and you did it. That's all that you should take from that. In giving myself relief from my own guilt, I had to get really good at practicing self-compassion, being kind to myself, understanding myself, where I was in that moment. As I said, wasn't always a great person when I was healing from all of my trauma. And I was really beating myself up about that for a long time. I felt terrible about some of the things I said to people. I felt terrible for some of the mean things that I did, the callous things that I did. I felt really bad about that, and I beat myself up about it for a long time. It wasn't until I started to recognize that hurt people. And for a long time, I was a hurt person who was hurting people. And I needed to forgive myself for that if I wanted to move forward and be someone who was loving and kind. Because if I continued to beat myself up about it, then that means I was still unhealed. I was still hurting. And as long as I'm still hurting, I was still going to keep hurting people. I needed to find a way to forgive myself, to feel compassion for myself. And I have an episode on that as well. If you want more thoughts on practicing self-compassion, self-love, please go and listen to that episode. But it's a lot of work, and I had to use that as a tool for processing this guilt that I had. Mindfulness was also really helpful, as I mentioned in the meditation practices, but anything that helps you to become aware of when an emotion arises in you, an emotion like guilt, what to do with it, how to sit with it, how to utilize it. All of that was very effective. But above all, just try to be as positive as you can in the face of your guilt. It can be really hard to move from past mistakes to having a bright, positive attitude about your future. So anything that we have guilt surrounding is usually something that already happened. Guilt is usually attached to the past. If you're feeling guilt, you're dwelling in the past. And we know that dwelling in the past isn't healthy. So whatever you can do to let the past go and to focus on the present moment, or even the bright, beautiful future that you're trying to build, do that instead of dwelling in the past. Turn your attention to the positive aspects of your life now, to the bright things you're looking forward to. And that's it for today, dear human. As always, I hope you found this episode useful. And if you did and would like to write into the show and ask me for my thoughts on something that you're dealing with, I always love to hear from you. You can contact me through any of my social media or through my email at corey@coreymshum.com. Otherwise, I will be back next week with another episode of A Well Cared For Human. And until then, please take good care of you. This episode of A Well Cared For Human was written and produced by me, Corey Marie. The music was by Late Night Feeler and Esther Abrami. If you like what I'm doing here, please consider visiting my Patreon. For as little as $1 a month, you get early ad-free access to the episodes, as well as a monthly patrons-only Q&A, bonus videos, and more. Not to mention that your Patreon support lets me know that you find value in the show and want it to continue. You can find me on Patreon by visiting www.patreon.com/Corey Marie. If you can't support the show financially, that is okay. You can still subscribe to the show, leave a review of the show, and recommend the show to your friends, not just the neurotic ones. All of this helps so much. And as always, thank you for listening.